Welcome. This is the Brennan Center for Justice event. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you're joining us from. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to repair, revitalize, and defend our systems of democracy and justice so they work for all Americans. I'm Deirdre Walsh, a congressional correspondent for NPR. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few minor housekeeping notes. As I said, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan organization. While it can't support or oppose any candidate for office, it can vigorously debate policies and positions that matter for our democracy. And this topic today is very important, especially in this election year. Civility is important for all of us, and the best way to have a productive conversation for everyone who's here today is to be civil. Those who post any rude or inappropriate comment will be removed from our message streams on Facebook or YouTube. We have live closed captioning that's going to be provided. So please follow along. And later in the program, there'll be an opportunity for questions from the audience. Really looking forward to hearing from folks. Follow along with the conversation on social media with the hashtag Brennan Center Live. So today's program, let's just start talking about the attacks and intimidation on state and local officials. The January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, where I sit today and where I'm coming to you live from, that attack and other high-profile incidents of political violence have really dominated the headlines for the last 3 years, and they've prompted calls for increased security for federal officials. I've covered the increasing threat environment for members of Congress from both parties, something the U.S. Capitol Police tracks, and has actually created new field offices in a couple of states, added additional staff to track. Death threats and swatting impacts lawmakers, their staffs, their families. But those serving in state and local government receive far less media attention and likely far less security to deal with this issue. A Brennan Center report released earlier this year highlights the gravity of this situation. 43% of state legislators and 18% of local office holders reported in this survey that they've experienced threats or attacks in recent years. If you add other categories of abuse, things like stalking, the numbers are far higher, in some categories as high as 89%. Those alarming conditions really do affect the health of our democracy. Abuse makes it just so much harder for office holders to do their jobs, to talk to constituents, to have open public events where they feel safe and have their neighbors feel safe. It makes them reluctant to engage in controversial topics, to be on social media engaging with their constituents. And intimidations of public servants is really, in some cases, having some question whether they want to continue to serve at all. This kind of intimidation is spreading like a disease, and we really can't ignore it. As we've heard here at the federal level, it's a factor for some lawmakers deciding to retire, some even before their term's up. Even last week, one House Republican, Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin, cited the death threats and swatting that he said he signed up for, but his young family did not. So that was a factor in his decision to retire early. Before we bring on our speakers to discuss this important topic, we're proud to begin this event today with remarks from New York State Attorney General Leticia James. She has firsthand experience with serving the public in the face of threats and abuse.
Hello, everyone. My name is Leticia James, and I'm the Attorney General of the great state of New York. It is an honor to address you as part of this important and timely event. I'd like to thank the Brennan Center for Justice for organizing this discussion to raise awareness about rising threats against state and local leaders. And I'd also like to recognize the immense effort and diligence that went into researching, investigating, and creating this report. The documented threats and abuse directed at state and local leaders is a very real problem with far-ranging implications. Public servants are being targeted for harassment, threats, and even violence by people who disagree with them, solely for doing their jobs. A key finding in the report that stood out most to me was that more than 20% of state office holders and approximately 40% of local office holders say they are less willing to work on controversial topics due to abuse. While 59% of state legislators believe that abuse has deterred their colleagues from taking on controversial topics, state and local leaders have a responsibility to tackle social issues that are oftentimes controversial. Due to increasing threats against public servants, a significant portion of these leaders are unable to uphold the duties of their office. This is having a chilling effect on our ability to tackle tough issues, from corruption to climate change to protecting people's basic rights. That is terrifying, and it is unacceptable. And it means that marginalized communities are suffering as a result of these threats and abuse being directed at public servants. The findings regarding the severity and nature of abuse with respect to women and office holders of color were equally troubling, and they further demonstrate the urgency of addressing and rectifying our current climate of rising abuse. I am disheartened by the abuse documented in this report, but I am hopeful about the changes that the Brennan Center for Justice propose. Public servants should not have to fear abuse, threats, and violence simply because they are following their oaths to the Constitution and the people they serve. With new security protocols in place and reasonable and transparent monitoring of these threats, we can make it safer for our local and state office holders to serve their communities and to uphold the law. Thank you.
Thank you to Attorney General James for participating in our event today. Her comments are really valuable from someone who understands this issue firsthand, and to hear her insights on this topic, and also talk about some hope for some solutions. I hope we get to a lot of that discussion today. I'm going to introduce our panelists today, here to discuss the rise of political violence and how we can address it going forward. We have Gowri Ramachandran. Gowri is Deputy Director for the Brennan Center Elections and Government Program and author of the recent report that I mentioned. We're going to point you to that report later where you can hear it, follow up and be able to read it in detail later on. Also joining us today, Florida Democratic State Representative Anna Eskamani. Thank you for joining us, Anna. We also have former Republican Nevada State Assemblymember Tom Roberts. Tom, thank you so much for joining with us today. We're lucky to have all of you here today. Good afternoon. I want to start with some questions, and I think I want to begin with Gowri, who did this survey and this report. We heard some of the statistics. I cited some. We heard Leticia James cite some. I wanted to ask you, Gowri, if you could talk about some of the themes. You talked to just a cross-section of office holders, state and local, across the country. What kind of themes arose as you looked at the survey results?
To me, one of the most striking themes that doesn't really come out from just the numbers, which can get a little dry, I know, is that so many of the people we spoke with directly, so we interviewed over 36 currently serving state legislators and former legislators as part of the study. So many of the people we spoke with were less concerned with themselves than they were with others. It was really, compelling to hear so many people speak of how they were very concerned with their constituents and their constituents feeling safe, engaging, coming to the Capitol to speak with their representatives, coming to town hall meetings, commenting on social media without being bullied by somebody online. They were really concerned with that. And so many of the people we spoke with were also very concerned with those who might follow them. So people who are thinking about running for office, thinking about going into public, and that the legislators we spoke with were really concerned with the ability of those who might come after them to follow in their footsteps. And then, of course, we heard people really compellingly speak about their concern for their families who, did not sign up for this kind of abuse, which nobody should be thought of as signing up for.
I want to bring in Tom on that note. Tom spent 4 years in the Nevada legislature, serving both under Republican administrations, Democratic administrations, probably different governors, party leaders in the state house. Tell me about your experience during your time in the legislature.
Well, I saw a gradual decline or an increase in incivility I think it stemmed from the 2016 election. I think that was a very incivil or uncivil election, and that just carried itself forward through the following elections. And a lot of the threats, unsubstantiated, I think fueled by social media, where used to be the fringe were kind of isolated by themselves. Now they can find common ground, and the attack stepped up. And for me, it was more for my own party than the opposite party. And to her point just a minute ago, a lot of my fellow legislators, specifically female legislators, seem to be more targeted than males. We have a female majority legislature. They had some really specific threats. And because I was a police officer for 30 years, a lot of them would come to me and say, what should I do? And I would encourage them to report it, so that we could start tracking that individual. Because if they're threatening you, they're threatening other people, and that behavior is only going to escalate. And I just think it's become the mainstream and not the fringe. And it's really gotten worse over the last few years.
I want to follow up on your law enforcement experience, because I've talked to the Capitol Police about how they deal with this issue for members of Congress. And it's definitely a new thing, a rising thing. They've, as I mentioned earlier, they've had to set up these task forces. How hard is it for local officials to track these threats? And is it something they're even really trained to handle? When during your time on the force, did these kinds of threats exist, or
well, they did. They did address. We have a fusion center, federally funded, that's throughout the state. We utilize that to track those threats. It's one of those, just when anti-terrorism, see something, say something. And the more that you start to track that behavior, you can actually build a case to either get restraining orders, or if they display weapons, you could do things further to surveil them. And a lot of those instances would start with public officials. It always seemed like public officials were the focus of somebody, and we would start tracking them to the point where we would put surveillance on a few people and get them into custody as quick as we could. So I think in Nevada we're pretty well equipped. I don't believe our Capitol Police were as much used to it. I mean, Carson City's 60,000 people. They're just not used to it. 2.4 million here in Southern Nevada. We've been dealing with it for a long time.
Right. I want to ask Anna about her experience. You've been serving constituents for 6 years. I'm sure some of this sounds somewhat familiar to you. How does the threat environment sort of change your job? What is it like?
Well, thanks again so much for having me. And unfortunately, it's actually just been a common theme in my public service work. Tom mentioned how women are experiencing, this type of vitriol at a higher level. And I can even just tell you, last week I got an email that was attacking me, and, it uses words that are not appropriate to share publicly, but basically asking if I am, mentally stable and so forth. I mean, and actually that's on the mild side. I mean, I've also, of course, been the target of sexual oriented attacks, comments about my figure and my facial features. Very common attack that I get is about the size of my nose, and my family is of Middle East descent. And so I know it's not just a comment that's trying to hurt me in my self-esteem, but it's also racially motivated. And on top of that, of course, just the constant misogyny. And, I've experienced even moments where these threats go viral, where I have a social media post that ends up in a very conservative logarithm, and then I just get flooded with these type of comments that have actually led to a direct death threat that's being investigated right now by my law enforcement. So it's really a difficult climate. And I think I have a unique perspective because I actually worked at Planned Parenthood before I ran for office. And so when I worked at Planned Parenthood Southwest and Central Florida, we were very proactive on issues of safety and security. I'm also trained on de-escalation, and I really practice that in my day-to-day alongside non-engagement. But the reality is when you are an elected official, it not only increases the target on your back, and then if you're vocal and a woman, it's even more defined. But as you were mentioning with Tom, we don't have local security like you might have at the Capitol. At least our Capitol, there's metal detectors, there's Capitol Police. In our district offices, we don't have that type of security. And so you really have to kind of put in place your own systems of safety, because it just doesn't exist for us. We don't have a budget for it. If I want to get cameras installed, I have to request it and work with my landlord. It's not something that the Capitol administration really provides you with the direct assistance on.
Wow. I mean, your experience to me is scary, but sadly, obviously something that a lot of people are dealing with. Anna, Tom talked about female colleagues coming to talk to him about strategies. What are your conversations like with your colleagues? I don't know the demographics of your state assembly, but is there like sort of unofficial support, even though you don't have this sort of broader security infrastructure that sounds like it could be helpful?
Yeah. So there's two dynamics here, right? There's the physical safety, but also the mental health and stress. And so I do think when it comes to mental health and stress perspective, you can find empathy partners. I mean, in particular, for us in the legislature, every person is going to be a potential target. But as the report demonstrates, and as we're discussing today, those that receive the most vitriol, the most frequent types of attacks and comments are going to be women. And what I've seen in Florida, predominantly women of color, alongside LGBTQ plus lawmakers. And with that said, we can find simpaticos with each other and kind of almost trying to laugh things off, right? Like, oh, look at this comment I just got. And honestly, I do think humor is a tool to cope. And so sometimes when I get some of these really offensive comments, I'll share it on social media. And I do that not only to deflate the power they're trying to have over me, but also to show the greater public that this is not a farce. Like, we are receiving these comments on a weekly basis. And I want you to be aware of that environment, because it is toxic. And as Tom mentioned, it comes from, unfortunately, bases of voters too. Like, this is not, coming out of coincidence or by chance. Like, these are our feelings that are kind of festering in different environments, and you become the target. But I don't think I'm the only target. I feel like
Right.
for folks who send me messages, they're also probably sending 10 messages at the same time to different people. In fact, the threat that I received, that was a direct threat, I received a call from U.S. Capitol Police because the same individual has sent a threatening message to a member of Congress. So they sent one to them and to me. And of course, we were both women of color that received this direct threat. And so there is that simpatico with your peers, but that physical safety piece is challenging, because part of the dynamic, and the report highlights this, is unless it's a direct threat, there's really nothing you can do, right? Law enforcement, you can report it, which is important to archive the history. But unless it steps a line, a lot of these folks know the line they can't cross, really isn't much you can do in accountability beyond revisit your safety systems and infrastructure. Beyond that, there really isn't a recourse. And so nothing stops this person from continuously harassing you. And the fear is that it could turn from this virtual experience to something in real life.
That is scary. I mean, we have seen here at the Capitol that some lawmakers do release audio of phone threats or screenshots of threats as a way to sort of prove how serious the issue is. Because I think some people maybe think like, oh, that happens all the time, but this is not normal, right? I want to bring
doing that too, Deirdre, if I may.
Sure.
I get scared sometimes to do that, because am I going to anger this person more by posting? Now, I'm a firm believer that when you're most afraid to speak is when you must speak, but that's also something in the back of my head of, am I escalating the situation when I do this? But I do think the public transparency has a lot of value.
Right. And Tom, when people come to you and ask you for advice, what do you say? Like,
well, the first thing is you need to report it, because a lot of times, to Anna's point, is you kind of get this so much. It's like, all right, it's just another nutbag that's sending me an email with 1,000 other people over some topic that we haven't even voted on yet. But sometimes there's subtle, threats and things like that I just believe that, yeah, you may think it's a waste of time, but it really isn't, because if you have people that are looking at this from a global standpoint, just like the Capitol Police she mentioned there, or let's say in Nevada, they're harassing a local official and a state official, and then when you start to link this all together, local law enforcement says, all right, this person's a problem, and we need to monitor what they're doing. And another thing is I'll tell folks is like, public events, in your area, in your district, necessarily where you do them at. And if you believe this person is going to be a threat, have some folks watching the crowd to look for this person, because I've had colleagues, Democrat colleagues, female Democrat colleagues, that these guys have actually, and we've had to escort them off. And we're fortunate enough here that most local police will put an officer out there at some of your events if you feel comfortable. They'll just do that for you. And you can pick a place where there are some screening things in place, whether that's a school, or whether there's some other protections where you're not allowed to have firearms and things like that. You pick those locations that minimize your threat. But the big key thing is reporting it.
I want to bring Gowri back into this conversation, because we heard from Anna and from Leticia James about the sort of impact on marginalized communities, office holders of color, women. We heard some very specific examples about how they're dealing with us. Can you just tell us what you found in the survey?
Yeah, what we found is that although this problem is universal, I don't want anyone to be mistaken about that. People of all races, religions, genders, sexual orientations are being subject to this abuse. And in fact, we found that among state legislators, Republicans were more likely to report that there's been an increase in the volume of this abuse in recent years. But despite all of that, we also found that women and people of color are particularly subject to really vitriolic abuse, as Anna said, and in some instances, greater levels of abuse. So, for instance, women were much more likely to be subject to sort of abuse that makes sexual comments or of a sexual nature. Women and people of color among local office holders were much more likely to be subject to abuse that mentions their family, which I think, just objectively, anyone can understand that the sort of impact of that and the severity of that is just inherently higher when somebody's, children or spouse or parents are being mentioned in the harassment and in the threat. So we definitely saw those differences. We saw that women were more likely to be subject to comments about their appearance, which Anna mentioned. And so you can just see how this would have a greater impact. And we did find that it was having a greater impact on the measures that people take. So women were more likely to report that they are kind of deterred from doing traditional media appearances, which is obviously super important during an election year. Women of color were especially likely to report being reluctant to hold those kind of public events that Tom was talking about, which are also so important in an election year and just at any time to engage with constituents. So we definitely saw these disparities, these disparate impacts. Women of color were especially likely to hire private security, which is really costly. But one thing I want to mention is that despite all of this, women of color were pretty similar to other demographic groups when it came to being deterred from running for re-election or for higher office. And I think it really fits with what we heard from folks in our interviews, which is that time and again, people said, nobody should have to withstand this abuse, but it's also so important for voices from different communities to be heard, to be there, to represent in local and state office. So many of the people we spoke with are just, willing to put up with it because they know how important public service is.
I think the disturbing trend that we're hearing, though, is that people feel like it's just part of the job now, which I think is sad. And I want to ask all of the panelists, because I think we heard Tom talk earlier about the influence of social media, sort of like when he saw this start around the 2016 election. Anna, you talked about social media. What do you think is driving the sort of, I don't know if I want to say resurgent, but it's the increase of political violence, or just the sort of how accessible it is and how easy it is to launch these kind of attacks? Let's start with Anna.
Well, I appreciate this question. And I do think social media is a part of the problem. I mean, not only are folks just emboldened to express positions and viewpoints that they would never do in person, but they have more direct access to people, and they don't have many consequences, as we've discussed. Again, I do encourage every person to report problematic and harassing comments, but at the end of the day, especially if you have an anonymous account, I mean, there's just so many challenges in tracking things. The email that I just received last week is from an anonymous email. I've had folks use just bogus emails and sending hateful and hurtful messages to me. And, it's a very challenging for there to be any type of follow-up in those situations. Sometimes you can work with law enforcement on IP addresses, but, these are folks that are also trying to avoid accountability. And with that said, they just continuously get away with it. My Facebook account in particular, a lot of folks have burner accounts. So it's not the real profiles. And, I do believe in the First Amendment. I'm a firm advocate for the First Amendment. So I'm not someone who blocks these types of comments. So you just have to navigate it. And I do think that we're living in very polarized times where social media algorithms reward sensational and kind of outrageous engagement. And so not only do the less controversial posts, they get less attention compared to posts that are more controversial that the user might share, but then the comments that are more vitriolic get more attention. So the social media companies also kind of benefit and feed into this cycle. And when we don't create spaces for civil discourse, then and the extreme language is rewarded, it does create this vicious cycle that pushes people to continuously do more to that edge. And again, the concern always is, what is that edge and what happens when you tip it over?
So Tom, what are you seeing?
Well, I think there's two things that are driving it. As Anna mentioned, social media and the algorithms. You watch one cat video and then that's all you get all day, right? And then it's same if you start looking at some topic or whatever that gets you fired up, you're just going to go down a rabbit hole, and it radicalizes you to do these things. I think the other thing is there's profit that is involved in some political consultants and stakeholders, not necessarily stakeholders, but I'd say advocacy groups and things like that, is that they want to rile up their members, and they'll spread misinformation or even twisted information and then fundraise off of it, right? There's a lot of models out there for that. In Nevada, I call them bottom feeder public consultants or consultants that just all they do is write vitriol newsletters, attack people, and some of them are just our own folks. If you're a Republican, that the Democrat is your enemy, right? But if you pick 2 or 3 Republicans that you think that have turned on you, and that makes you worse because they're supposed to be on your side. And then so they'll attack you, they'll boast their mailing list, and they'll fundraise off of it. And I think that drives a lot of it too, because that behavior is not curbed either.
I want to ask Gowri about this. Is that kind of partisan tribalism something that you saw in your survey that is part behind this? Because there's this word structure.
It's absolutely something that the people we interviewed spoke about very frequently, that kind of partisan behavior and just, trying to feed really the most, the most uncivil and unproductive type of discourse instead of focusing on policy disagreements and trying to, hash those out, right? So we overwhelmingly saw people welcome vehement disagreement, welcome debate, right? But don't welcome this kind of focus on issues and vitriol that isn't why really many people go into public office in the first place. And one of the recommendations we made in the report, I think it really speaks to this. And it's something that we drew from so many people telling us that that's one of the things that in the past, when they've suffered this kind of abuse, has helped and helped them stick with the job. And that is hearing other public leaders, whether it's other legislators, other local officials, business leaders, community leaders, call out this behavior, right? So hearing someone else call it out, especially someone across the aisle, we heard multiple times, is really especially helpful, just to give someone, the wherewithal to push through it, and also to discourage more of the behavior, right? If you have public leaders saying this isn't how democracy works, this isn't how you're supposed to debate, this is not getting us anywhere on policy, it can really make that difference. We heard from one legislator about, a PAC that had put out a really problematic mailer about her. And then when other candidates who were opposing her called it out and said they weren't going to work, with that organization anymore, it really meant a lot to her.
Right. I mean, that is important. I mean, these attacks clearly cross the line time and time again. I want to ask Anna, though, I mean, have you had an assist from stakeholders in the community? I mean, it sounds like these attacks have been unfortunately pretty regular for you. Have you seen people call it out or do you think needs to be more of a sort of bipartisan code that this is not acceptable?
Yeah. Well, I want to echo a point that Tom made too about how, there's this cannibalization of our politics right now. And there have been situations where I've seen some of my female colleagues on the opposing political aisle also face different types of vitriol from members of my own party, right? For something they said or a vote that they took and so forth. And again, I think policy criticism is 100% appropriate. But what's inappropriate is when it stems into the space that we just talked about, right? Where it's harassing, where it's personal, where it's threatening, where someone's doxxed and so forth. And so I do think it's important to publicly say that this is inappropriate, that I don't support what people are doing. And I think that sign of solidarity to embrace civil discourse, it's important for each one of us to model that. The challenge is when we model it, it also puts a target on our back because then sometimes we get targeted by those same people who are mad that we're modeling this behavior. So it's just so complicated, right? Because the social media platforms don't offer a space for nuance. And so when you try to lead with nuance, sometimes it also can backlash on you, which is why I think many people are hesitant to get involved. There might be situations where Republican colleagues text me when I post about something that happened. Maybe, in fact, I think these days that's less rare, but they rarely will say anything publicly around, hey, I know her, don't treat her like this, right? And I also want to add to the role that traditional media plays. Tom was mentioning the blogs, and we have the same dynamic in Florida. I notice a pattern. Whenever I start seeing this huge influx in negative and just harassing comments or emails come in, it's typically because I have been mentioned on some sort of either a Fox News story or a conservative blog. It's just like clockwork. I can trace it back.
The cycle that goes, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's so frustrating, but it's almost predictable now. And again, it's just the reality of what we have to deal with every day in this work.
Tom was mentioning, you sort of know who some of these people are and they're sort of regular partisans. Have there been kind of the conversations inside the State House amongst your colleagues about this crosses the line, or there's one thing to put, we all see political ads, right, that take advantage of the opposing party's position on a issue that's really important in the campaign or in the debate in the legislature. But when it becomes a personal security issue, are there conversations about that?
Well, I mean, we only have 63 legislators here, so it's a pretty small group. But even in our caucus, we would have discussions, about some of the behavior in posts like that. And there's just some of my colleagues that just would not call it out. I live in a fairly moderate district, so I think I had the ability to do that. My direct voters didn't go after me. It was always people that didn't even live in my area. But some of those folks that lived in really hard red districts just would not do it. I give you an example. There was all this election fraud, accusations in the 2020 election. Our Secretary of State was a Republican, and people were attacking her, really bad. And there was a few of us that stood up for her, but just a few of us. Everybody else kind of stuck in the shadows. And to Anna's point, is they'll just watch the barbs thrown at you, and rather than put themselves out there and call it out. But I think it is important to call it out. And the more people that do, I think the less folks will be apt to do this, especially, well, not with real names, at least.
Right. I want to bring Gowri in because we started to talk about the differences you saw, like things like race and gender. But what other demographic divisions did you see among office holders? Did you see anything based on age, on income, in terms of the reports of this kind of intimidation?
Yeah, we did take a look at both age and income level in combination with gender. And some of the stats I mentioned before, we looked at, the intersection of race and gender. So we checked to see if, women of color were experiencing particular impacts at greater rates than other women or men of color, for instance. When it comes to age in particular, we did find that, as office holders, local office holders among that group, we found in particular, as they were younger, they were experiencing greater rates of all of these kinds of abuse, threats, harassment, and insults, which are the three major forms of abuse that we saw at pretty high rates. And I think that's really interesting to see. It's hard to know if that's because younger generations are really willing to call things what they are and
Right.
Acknowledge the abuse, or if the sort of levels are greater. I think, the patterns we saw, I would think it's probably a combination of both. And I would also say in terms of income level, it may not be surprising, but it really tells you how important the impact of this issue is. People with lower incomes were less likely to report taking some of the kinds of self-help measures that folks are using. So things like hiring private security, moving homes, moving offices. So we did see those differences.
And I've heard from lawmakers, I'm sure you all have family members who've had to deal with this. I mean, it's one thing when it's happening to you, but affects the whole family. It affects your staff. It affects your office, where you work, but also your home. Before we get to the Q&A from the audience, I do want to spend a couple minutes talking about solutions, if we can sort of try to pivot and think about some best practices going forward. I'll start with Anna. If you could wave your magic wand, what kind of changes would you make to reduce the level of intimidation? I mean, I think we don't necessarily think it's all going to just go away, but what things would you like to see happen?
Well, there are short-term needs and long-term needs. I mean, I think long-term, we really need to emphasize opportunities for civil discourse within our K-12 educational curriculum. I do think there would be a huge benefit, to even integrate into government classes a conversation and practice on what is civil discourse, why does it matter, and to really just kind of address the realities that all of our young people are growing up with access to social media, and thus are also going to be exposed to some of the really bad aspects of social media. I want to be clear. I think social media is a very powerful tool and a connector, and it can be a support space for many people as well. But then you're still going to witness the extremes of it. And it would be really helpful for young people to be equipped and to not be bullied, let alone become a bully. So I think that's important in the long term. In the short term, just thinking about the institutions that we serve in, there definitely needs to be more intentional training for lawmakers. I mentioned that I worked at Planned Parenthood, so I kind of come into this work with a lot of experience. I train my team on de-escalation. We do a pretty robust safety and security training that is separate from anything the legislature provides. We even go over what to do if you are doxxed and what does that mean? And I think that type of training with legislative staff and lawmakers themselves would be really important, but also sets a tone. The legislature doesn't accept this behavior, and we're not going to accept it for anyone. Because I will say, sometimes there feels a sense of a bias based on who is the majority. Where, if I report something to the speaker's office, it won't get the same attention than if another colleague does, based on political party. I don't think that's true in reality, but the perception also hinders people from even reporting something in the first place. So we do want to see that institutionalization, if you will, of that educational content and to teach people, who do you talk to when this happens? And I think that can reinforce accountability.
Tom, you mentioned some best practices in terms of where elected officials hold events. Can you think of other ways to sort of tamp down the intimidation, or at least try to prevent it?
I think Anna makes a great point, with training and exposing legislators and candidates and those that hold political office, some of those risk assessments and some of the tools that you can use to keep yourself safe. I mean, I think that is really important. And the more discussion that we have about this topic, I really want to thank Brennan Center for digging down into the data and really exposing some of the issues, because that can point you in a direction where you can come up with some innovative ideas to combat this thing. In policing, my policing strategies I stole from somewhere else. So there's got to be some states that are doing it better than we are. And I think the more conversations that we have around this, we can come up with some good strategies to combat it, moving forward, long term and short term. Anna had a great answer to the question.
I think Gowri, we'll go to you, and then we'll go to audience questions. We've got already starting to get some really great questions from the audience. From your research, Gowri, were there solutions that were sort of geared towards some of the underrepresented communities dealing with this kind of intimidation?
Yeah, I would say, one thing we heard frequently was that, unfortunately, sometimes the very topics that people are really being out front on are actually, and that are potentially provoking some of this abuse, are topics that can cause them to have a really uncomfortable and not positive relationship with law enforcement. So many folks we spoke with who, were in favor of gun safety regulation or criminal justice reform, did not feel like they or their supporters had a really great relationship with law enforcement. So they were often reluctant to say, let's have a big security, like law enforcement presence at my public events and that sort of thing, because they were really time and again worried about how their constituents would feel and if they would feel safe and comfortable in that situation. So we did, as part of our recommendations, include things that are more sort of proactive as opposed to, the sort of after it happens law enforcement response. And that includes things like expanding address confidentiality programs to ensure that they cover elected officials if they don't. It also includes ensuring that state and local officials can spend their campaign funds, and even when they're candidates before they become an official, on legitimate security expenditures so that they can, hire that kind of private security if needed. And I think all of those things have a positive impact for underrepresented communities.
So we got a question that touched on a topic that we sort of got into a little bit in terms of polarization. We heard from the panelists talking about tribalism can kind of fuel the intimidation, make it worse on social media. But I'm wondering if you think polarization and political violence is changing the composition, the ideological composition of state houses. Is it disincentivizing people who are maybe more moderate and not espousing sort of, extreme positions or ideologically strong positions from the right or the left from even wanting to serve?
Yeah, I mean, I can start there, and I would agree with that, right? We have a ballot initiative to make open primaries, and I think what that does is that would soften both sides of the aisle when it comes, because it seems like the more fringe behavior controls the narrative in a primary, and so open primaries could certainly help you get a more moderate electorate at your state house or wherever it is, because I believe that because you have this really strict partisanship and polarization, that people aren't going to get to the middle on anything, and those that do are like like me and a couple other colleagues. We're just vilified by our own people, and when you got a good piece of legislation when everybody's mad at you, right? And so you don't have any of that anymore. You just have all this polarization, and it doesn't allow us to impact good policy.
Tom, do you think it impacts? It sounds like it's impacting what comes out of the legislature, not only who wants to serve, but what comes out.
Well, and you have interest. Another thing is not just the most active people in each political party, but you have special interest groups that also just won't bend on any position either, whether that's gun rights, whether it's unions or whatever. I mean, when you get a bill and typically, we would try to work to where all sides are happy. Sometimes that just won't happen, right? And they'll drive up their membership, and sometimes you get this incivility behavior that is a result.
Anna, I wanted you to weigh in on that issue.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question, and for me, it's also a distinction when we use the term moderate. Are we referring to someone who has moderate policy positions, or someone who has a moderate tone and approach to policy making? Because I think there are going to be folks who are very conservative in their belief system and perhaps very liberal as well, but it doesn't mean they come into the space to be combative. They're going to hold their values. They're going to work within the framework of the Overton window that they have available to them, but they're not designed. They're not there to be bombastic or to be, combative to people. And so I do think tone sometimes makes more of a difference than even policy, because it's one thing to have a policy position that some might find repulsive, but then there's other ways that you can at least speak to it and address others where you're being respectful. and so sometimes the tone, makes more of an impact than I even think the policy itself. And you could also be someone who has a moderate policy position, but be incredibly combative and kind of entice disagreement in a way where it incentivizes others to mimic you. With that said, it absolutely keeps good people out, thoughtful policymakers who want to be collaborative. It keeps us out, while also encouraging voters to support the extremes. Tom mentioned open primaries. So Florida is a closed primary state, which means people tend to run towards the candidate that reflects the edges more than the middle. And so it does create this environment where, the person who is saying that elections are results are false and, using really vitriol rhetoric about immigrants and reproductive rights, all these issues, they will tend to get more attention and thus more name ID and potentially win, compared to their opponents who are not leveraging that same approach. And again, because the political system reward the extremism, it's all people see, and then it's what people think is normal.
Right. I'm wondering, Gowri, if the survey respondents cited this sort of disincentive or this polarization increase?
Yeah, I think definitely one of the results that I think was so sort of, almost shocking in the survey was that not only did about 1 in 5 state legislators say that all of this does make them reluctant to speak out on controversial issues, they felt about close to about 60% of them felt it was deterring their colleagues from speaking out on those issues. So that tells you that the impact it's having on actual policy proposals, on the compromises people do or do not reach, is definitely there. So I think I wasn't expecting, public officials, I think, really pride themselves on doing what they believe in. And so I wasn't expecting people to, even in an anonymous survey, kind of
Own up to the fact that it has an
looking
impact.
and say it, but people did. And so I think that tells you that the numbers are really high and the impact's big.
Another question we got, which touches on a topic that we've all discussed so far, is social media. And the question is, what can companies and regulators do to address the role of social media in enabling the abuse of officeholders, this rise of intimidation? Obviously, Anna, you talked about the First Amendment. That's obviously a key factor when we talk about public discourse, but this is just an age-old question, right?
Yeah. So I always want to give credit where credit is due. And I do think that in particular, Instagram over the past years has provided some new safety tools that if you're familiar with, can potentially help to address some of this. Like, for example, you can, instead of blocking people, you can hide comments. So comments that are scary and harassing, you can at least try to restrict the presence of that, which can create an unsafe environment, not just for yourself, but also for others, as kind of escalating the situation. There's also features on keywords. So, for example, you can automatically hide comments for someone that's using a derogatory term. And it does make a difference because, again, a lot of us don't have staff. I'm lucky in Florida. I have 2 full-time staffers, but they don't manage my social media. They don't have the capacity to. We have a district of 188,000 people. So it really is just me that is also trying to keep these platforms up to date while also looking at the comments and being thoughtful, because it's not just about me. It's also about those who are using the platform. If someone makes a comment that is hurtful towards a group of people, I don't want that comment to be there. But also I can't delete it, because then I'm censoring. So it is this kind of constant, back and forth. But the social media companies, they do have their terms of agreement, and obviously they're not always equally applied. So that needs to be dramatically improved. There needs to be a much better reporting mechanism and the ability to actually talk to someone about these versus just report it and getting a stale response back. And then back to my earlier point about training, I think that the legislative staff, in our case, the legislative administration, they should train us on these social media safety features. I only know it because I've explored them, but no one ever sat me down to teach me, here are some safety tools you have on social media. And I think that would be very beneficial. Last point I'll make is these algorithms, again, are so problematic. The video that led to me receiving a death threat was a joke. Like, it was one of the trends on social media. It wasn't even a serious video. And that is what led me to get a death threat. So it doesn't even matter what you're posting. You can make a fun, harmless video and then you end up with a death threat. And it was all because Meta started shooting this video into dark places on the internet that led to this traffic of comments. And so it doesn't even matter what you post sometimes. These algorithms, they just operate in a way that can cause a lot of harm.
Right. I mean, we've seen at the Capitol, there's really a real inability for Congress at the federal level to pass bipartisan legislation addressing social media companies. Tom, do you think there's a role at the state level? Is it more manageable there, or is it more about a code of conduct?
It's difficult to regulate social media at the state level. It's really a federal thing. I mean, some of the bigger states might be able to. A small state like Nevada, I don't think we're just savvy enough. But to Anna's point, I think social media companies have a responsibility to address those issues and constantly reevaluate what they're doing. But at the same time, you don't suppress free speech. I mean, I think sometimes you can curb behavior by opening up some of these folks for civil liability, and making it easier to, if they're not responsive and they don't do the things they should be, then they should be civilly liable. That seems to move the needle sometimes, but I think that's difficult to do at the state level.
We are getting sort of the time towards the end of our program, and I wanted to just do a quick lightning round, if I could, and go around to our panelists. And I want to start with Gowri. For the audience that's listening today, and thank you so much for the questions. I feel like we got a lot of similar questions, and I hope we got to touch on the topics that people wanted to hear about. But Gowri, what is the one thing you want our audience to walk away from this discussion today thinking about?
I think I would really love for people to remember that abuse, harassment, threats, stalking, all of this behavior is not helpful to democracy, and it's not what the majority of constituents want. So it's not normal. It shouldn't be normalized. And civil debate, open debate, where people are free to speak their views, that's what the majority of Americans want, and it's what the majority of office holders want to engage with.
Anna, can I go to you next?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to echo those points, I mean, I think it's so important for us to model civil discourse. And I actually make it a policy of mine, an internal policy of mine, that I do not tweet at colleagues. Even if I disagree with your legislation, I will focus on the substance of the bill. I will not drag colleagues on social media because I don't want to add to this culture of polarization, of pettiness, and continue the escalation of harm. And so I do think that as elected officials, we can model the behavior of how we want to be treated. We can absolutely do that ourselves.
And Tom?
I agree with Anna. I think we need to model that behavior. And I think social media, keyboard tough guys, that there's just nobody really watching you. And if you were to say that to somebody's face, you just would never do that. And if you take that policy, it's like, if I'm on the floor of the legislature, well, to some people, I guess it wouldn't matter, but you try to model yourself to where, if your mother was watching or paying attention, that she'd be proud of you, right? And you're not attacking somebody because of their religious background or facial features or whatever it might be, that's just not productive in what we do. And I think we need to stay away from it.
I think a lot of people would benefit from the conversation we've had today, bipartisan conversation based on research and data. And I really want to thank all of our panelists today, Anna, Gowri, Tom. I wish that we could have gotten to everyone's questions today, a lot of good questions. I want to point our audience today to the report that we talked about that sort of kicked off this conversation. It's called Intimidation of State and Local Office Holders. That and other resources that the Brennan Center has helpfully pulled together with their research is at brennancenter.org. We hope they'll see some of our audience at future events. Please sign up. If you want to know more about more events that the Brennan Center is putting on, these virtual events really help pull together people from across the country. And I think I've really learned a lot today. I appreciate it. So be sure to sign up for the newsletter. It's at brennancenter.org/events. Again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much to the Brennan Center for the important work that you've done in this space as we head into an election year. This is an invaluable conversation we'll just continue to have. I'm Deirdre Walsh, congressional correspondent at NPR. Thank you all for coming this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.